I feel like we're kind of on the back foot as scientists and science communicators, because disinformation campaigns have been so successful in reaching large numbers of people and planting the seeds of doubt and fear.
Welcome to the Reproducibility Podcast, an open science podcast that talks about the credibility revolution in science and tries to feature early career researcher voices and perspectives on the movement. I'm Nguyen, lecturer at the University of Adelaide in Australia, which is on the land of the Kaurna people, and I'd like to acknowledge their past, present and future custodianship of the land that I currently reside and work on. In this episode, I'm joined by Jamie Moffa. They're a MD PhD student at Washington University in St. Louis and is the host of a science communication podcast in plain English. Jamie, do you want to give a bit more background about who you are, what you do?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for having me on the podcast. So, like Will said, I am an MD PhD student at Washington University in St. Louis. I also host In Plain English, which is a science communication podcast that brings on experts and non-expert guests so that they can have a conversation about science in a way that is accessible and approachable to everybody, not just, keeping it all with jargony language in the ivory tower. So that's kind of what I'm all about. And I have been having a great year of science communication, so I'm excited to be back on reproducibility.
Yeah, very cool. I guess it'd be nice to go for a bit of backstory of how we met.
Yeah.
So I've actually been on the In Plain English podcast episode previously. Highly recommend everyone go to listen to that episode. We met at SFN, Society for Neuroscience.
Yes.
You
did a panel.
You reached out to me.
Yeah.
Yes, I was in a panel organized by the NINDS Office of Research Integrity, and it was a panel on research rigor, championing research rigor generally, broadly. And you were there, I think.
I was, yeah. It was a really cool panel that I was really interested to connect with other people who do similar work in reproducibility, and I see science communication as a really important part of that work. I had also at the same conference linked up with a group called Community for Rigor. So it kind of felt like the theme of that Society for Neuroscience conference was like reproducibility and rigor. And so I reached out because you said that you did a podcast, and I was like, ding, 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 collaboration time.
Yeah, very cool. And then in that episode that we had together, that conversation, it was, we talked about a lot of topics, but I noticed that a theme that came up on re-listening was how rigor is really important, like scientific rigor is really important in our relationship with, so science's relationship with the public. And
right.
For example, we talked a little bit about how there's misinformation and sort of distrust in especially the current age where everything's very digital. So it's sort of really important now to build up rigor and I guess reform how we're communicating science. Feels like you've been in that space more than others, really, truly. So yeah, what's your sort of overall overview so far, and how science communication could be reformed, and where does it sit in that kind of little pocket between rigor, scientific rigor, and communication to the public, and that relationship?
Oh boy, that's such a big question, and I've been having a ton of thoughts on that lately. Well, I mentioned Community for Rigor earlier, and I actually did a live show podcast episode with them earlier this year at the University of Pennsylvania. And so this came up a lot with respect to, not only how do we promote rigor and like increase rigor among scientists, but also how does that affect how we communicate science to the public? Because it does matter that people who are not scientists understand and see the evidence of scientists doing a good job and really like checking their work and making sure that they're doing the best that they can to be finding out things that are true and relevant about the world. Because a lot of distrust in science comes from fears about scientists not doing that, not being careful, or having motives that push them in one direction or another. And that's not to say that anybody, obviously some people do this intentionally and maliciously, but most people just like unintentionally, but because of the incentive structure of academia or needing to publish or what have you, end up with less than rigorous or reproducible work that then, in the public consciousness gets lumped in with people who are malicious and deliberately, lying about stuff, and all gets lumped into this milieu of, we can't trust what they're saying. So it's really important that like not only do we be rigorous, but we put that in front of the public and say, look, this is us actively right now working on doing rigorous research, and this is how that's implemented, and this is why data that you see coming out in studies might sometimes not be correct, and it's not necessarily because anybody did anything wrong. It's because that's how science works. So I think there's a lot of room for science communication, not only to take on the role of telling people about science, but also telling people about how science is done.
Yeah, like bringing philosophy of science a little bit to the public and to scientists, and then reforming that sort of like how we are communicating to the public. I guess like a very simple question is, do you think we're doing enough scientific communication, or are we doing it in the right way at all?
Oh boy. So I don't know if enough, because we certainly are doing a lot of it. And it seems like it's become a more talked about endeavor recently. Like WashU has a science communication credential. There are a lot of science communication fellowships like the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship that really focus on training people to be science communicators. So it feels like more than ever, we are doing a lot of science communication. But I think what we are getting stuck on is doing it in the most efficient way. Because if you think about it, I feel like we're kind of on the back foot as scientists and science communicators, because disinformation campaigns have been so successful in reaching large numbers of people and planting the seeds of doubt and fear in their minds about anything from climate change to COVID vaccines to, what have you. The people who are trying to spread disinformation have done a good job of it. And we're on the side of needing to counter that, but B, I think that we're not being as effective as the people who have spread misinformation and seeded distrust and lies among the general public, right? I think part of it is that approaching science communication from a very top-down perspective of I know all the things and I'm going to tell you all the things, whereas people who spread misinformation more often approach it from a perspective of, you could be one of the people who's in the know about this conspiracy that other people don't want you to know about, and it's letting them in rather than talking down, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right.
So yeah,
this is totally reflects sort of what I'm seeing too. I'm thinking about how a lot of psychologists, especially cognitive psychologists, my field, is starting to think about like doing research on who like falls for misinformation, and we're trying small interventions. Like I think I've seen the term like misinformation vaccines or something, where they like it's like intervention, like hey, like double check what you're doing, like a little bit like, are you catching things? Are you critically evaluating things? And none of it seems to be getting that much traction, really. It just feels like we're sort of bystanders and observing this huge thing that's happening around us. And
Right.
that connects with the movement to try and reform and be rigorous. So we have to be careful about that message, right? Like, we're acknowledging things are going wrong and we're trying to fix it, but we don't want the message to the public being everything is wrong. Nothing is credible. Yeah.
It's a difficult position to be operating from. And yeah, I could talk forever about all the different things that I see that like could be done better in this space, but
we might get there.
We could get there. It's true.
I guess it'd be helpful for our viewers to maybe get to know a bit more about what kind of scientific communication projects you have been involved in, so they know what kind of spaces you've been operating within.
Yeah. So obviously, I have my podcast, which we've already talked about. I kind of got my start in science communication a long time ago, pre-COVID. I was involved in a website called Pride in Practice. It was a group of medical professionals, medical students, people in that space writing about the latest advances in LGBTQ health. And the audience was other healthcare providers. So a very targeted audience, educating people who are either doctors, nurses, NPs, otherwise like patient facing, who want to have a more inclusive healthcare practice when it comes to LGBTQ people, but maybe don't necessarily know all of the most recent data or information. So I kind of got my science communication start there. I was the transgender medicine section editor. I collected pieces for the section. I also wrote a couple of informative pieces for that section, and really, got to see what it was like to communicate science for a very specific audience. But it kind of got my foot in the door. I've also been involved at WashU in that science communication credential that I mentioned earlier. So that has me doing a lot of editing of scientific writing, as well as obviously doing practical SciComm experiences like having a podcast and taking courses in the most effective methods of science communication. So that's kind of my credentials.
Awesome. I'd also love to hear a little bit more about your podcast in plain English, and sort of, I'm curious how you came about the idea and the motivation, and sort of how do you now approach it? Because you did mention you've got sort of expert guests, or let's say content expert guests, and also non-expert. So what's that dynamic like?
I had the idea was percolating since maybe about 2019 and throughout the pandemic in 2020 to do a science communication podcast, because I at the time was getting really, really into listening to podcasts, and to do the kind of initial thought that I had was a journal club in plain English. So the in plain English part stuck around. I figured people wouldn't necessarily know what a journal club is, so I lopped that part off. But a journal club in plain English, and what that means is in a journal club, you have one person who presents a paper. Usually it's the journal club as a whole has a specific topic area that it's interested in. So the paper is on a particular topic, and one person presents the paper, and then everybody else who's in attendance discusses it. Usually in journal clubs within academia, this is a very contentious discussion. Oftentimes people are criticizing the paper, sometimes in not very constructive ways. So I didn't really want to keep that, and I understood that it would be more informative to go through the paper maybe more as an example of this kind of science that maybe people have never heard of people doing or weren't aware that that was a field that people were researching. But I wanted to keep the group dialogue aspect of having a journal club, because it's no fun to just sit in front of a microphone and tell nobody about a paper. That's kind of lame. So
Yeah.
literally no one wants to hear that. So to get it to be the science communication aspect, I was like, okay, what if the content area expert has to present the paper to two other people who don't know what the topic is about? I mean, like, they know ahead of time, they like get the paper and see that it's about astrophysics, but they're like, I don't know how to make heads or tails of astrophysics. So it's really incumbent on the content area expert to go through this paper in a way that's going to make sense, and then also talk about the implications of the paper and oftentimes the broader implications of the whole field in a way that's going to make sense to the people that they're discussing with. And so then we have a nice chat about a paper, and yeah, I think that I've really enjoyed the format. I've learned a lot. Oftentimes the topics I pick are just because I really want to know about it. And so I ask somebody, I'm like, I really want to know about this thing. Can you come talk about this thing?
Yeah, I have listened to a few of the episodes, and yeah, the vibes are good. I highly recommend our listeners go and check it out. And I find myself learning a lot as well, like having similar questions to the non-experts or non-expert guests, and being like, yeah, I did want to know about that, and like seeing someone communicate, an expert communicate in a space to a more sort of generalized, sort of trying to strip away the jargon and the like nitty gritty details to get the message across. Is really like effective, right? It's an effective way to like understand and learn.
I think, another cool aspect, just for a second, is that I usually bring on trainees as the content area experts, which both gets those trainees, usually grad students or postdocs, more experience in communicating in this way, and also means that they're a little bit closer to when they weren't an expert yet, versus someone who's been a professor for 30 years might not really remember what it was like to not know about like dopamine neurons.
Yes, it's common to have like the best teacher is actually the teacher who just learnt the thing ahead and figured it out and is able to then communicate their aha moment to the trainee or to whoever they're teaching. Yeah, absolutely. Very cool. So I guess we're going to do something similar-ish in this next little section for us. You showed me this paper by Sophia Volk, assessing the outputs, outcomes, and impacts of science communication, a quantitative content analysis of 128 science communication projects.
That is a mouthful of a title.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's good. And we're going to use that as a bit of a springboard to talk about what are the best practices to thinking about what is a good way of communicating science, and thinking about how we can make some science communication a bit more rigorous and a bit more effective. So, what were your highlights out of that paper?
Yeah, so I'm going to do a really broad overview highlights because I think that the implications are more interesting than just going through a bunch of statistics. So the general background was that this was a study done in Switzerland. It's the kind of study that you can really only do in European countries that have these large databases of studies that are publicly accessible to researchers. So this person looked at 128 science communication projects that were funded by the Swiss government with grants that happened between 2012 and 2022. That's our time frame. And they looked at how many of these studies were evaluated by the researchers doing them at all for their efficacy, which is kind of a requirement for getting this kind of grant from the Swiss government. So you'd think that the answer would be all of them, but you would be wrong. And then how were they evaluated? And can that evaluation tell us anything about whether the science communication project really changed people's minds or changed the society in which it was being done? So, quick takeaway: one third of these Swiss government funded science communication projects were not evaluated at all for their efficacy. 0 surveys or any attempt at figuring out, did people like it? Did people come? Did it work? None. So fully 1/3 of studies right off the bat just didn't do any evaluation, which is really shocking to me. But I think it speaks to, like, obviously you're not funded by the Swiss government. I'm not funded by the Swiss or any government, or anybody. I'm not funded by anybody. But I can't think of a science communication project that I can point to and say, like, yeah, they've done robust evaluation on what they're doing and they've figured out that what they're doing works. So
feels like a hard problem, right? It's
It
a
is.
difficult thing to evaluate. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a quote that I'm going to paraphrase from this article that was like, people's attitudes about science are relatively fixed, and the impacts of science communication on society are going to be indirect and long term. So, yeah, how do you do communication in such a way that you're going to nudge people's relatively fixed attitudes towards more knowledge about a subject, or like taking action on a subject, or even advocating in government for a subject such as like around climate change is really, really important. So that's basically one big problem, is how do you get people to change their beliefs, attitudes, knowledge? And another big problem is, how do you measure the overall impacts that we would want science communication to have when all of those impacts are really nebulous and tied to a lot more things than just this one project that you and your team of people are able to put together, even with money from the Swiss government?
Yeah, it's tricky. Like, also in my mind, wouldn't say alarm bells are going off, but if you try and think of a measure or a way to evaluate these science communication efforts, they start to become maybe like a target, and then the measure starts to lose its sort of like effectiveness, and
Right.
it becomes standardized. And that's not the, like, I feel like diversity of science communication efforts is really important, and you don't want to make it homogenous through what it's evaluated to do.
Right.
So it feels like, yeah, there's like needs to be a one-to-one evaluation of the project each time, which seems like a lot of effort.
It is, yeah. And the author of this paper makes a point that there's a concept, and I forget exactly what field of research it comes from, but there's a concept of using logic models to figure out how you expect your intervention to affect the people who are participating, and then evaluating it in the context of that expectation. So, for example, you wouldn't apply a kind of evaluation to a sort of standalone science like exhibit, right? Something that pops up and it's like one day only, people come to see, you know, a display that's about the greenhouse effect, right? Where you have like a live demonstration that shows that you have like CO2 in this chamber and the temperature does this and blah, blah, blah. You wouldn't really expect that the impact of that, which is one time, very one way, you're just talking at people, to have a super longitudinal impact on their attitudes and beliefs. It might affect their immediate understanding, so you might be able to ask them afterwards, like, do you understand what the greenhouse effect is? And they'll go yes. But you wouldn't evaluate it on whether or not it got them to become climate activists, because that's not really there's no logical model in which you doing that has that effect.
Right, right. And it's multifaceted, the effects, right? Like,
Yeah.
It might spark a curiosity to go in a little bit more, or to
Right. So
rethink
how
some
do
of the
you,
things.
yeah, how do you measure the effect that is a high school student leaving that demonstration and getting involved and like deciding to take environmental science next year, and then because of that getting involved with a local cleanup group, and then because of that getting involved with a climate advocacy organization? Like, how do you can't really track that.
It's a difficult issue, a difficult problem. And I think it's constantly changing. So the thing that comes to my mind is, with the advent of digital media, like also, the I was about to say the devolving into short form content, but maybe I shouldn't be so biased. The use of more, like, the trend towards short form content and things like that, and how we evaluate a lot of social media through like metrics like engagement, likes,
Right.
things like that. Has that sort of made science communication projects easier to evaluate, but also worsened their quality? That's sort of where I'm sitting here. Yeah. How do you feel about how social media has changed the way we think and evaluate about scientific communication projects?
Yeah, so definitely, I mean, as with anything, social media is a tool and it has its pros and cons. So, pro, you can reach a lot of people in places where you wouldn't have been able to reach them before. You effectively have as close to a global audience as you could possibly have. A con of that is that it makes your target audience a lot more nebulous. So you could develop something like the Pride in Practice project I was involved with that specifically targets one group of people. But the temptation about social media, and again, maybe this is a good and a bad thing too, is that you can reach anybody. So why hone your audience when you can try to appeal to as many people as possible? Another pro of social media is that it allows for longer term engagement. It's not just setting up a science exhibit and taking it down, or doing like a one-time lecture at a local high school. You can build an audience and continue interacting with them. A con is that the interaction, unless you really specifically try to build a bi-directional relationship with your audience, the interaction is going to be very one-sided. Like, you are creating a thing, you're putting out there, and other people are consuming it. Not only does that create like a weird parasocial relationship where they know a lot more about you, the creator, than you do about all of them, but also it kind of leads into a model where you have all the information and you're telling it to them, as opposed to inviting people into a conversation and sort of collaboratively working on like discussing things that specific people are interested in, right? It's unidirectional. It's like, I think you should know this, unless you really try to foster it another way. So those are just the two that come right to the top of my mind, that have like good and bad sides to them.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about it that way. And I think of like, so a couple examples come to mind. Maybe we can talk about a few examples of our own experiences, things we, on both sides, being the consumer or not. The first one that comes to mind regarding social media and having this like one-off element where it feels like being the content expert and creator, it lends itself to this model of you have to give the information to your audience, and that's the interaction. I've noticed there's a little bit of a pocket for like streamers, like Twitch streamers and YouTube streamers, to be science communicators. So I've come across a few in the Twitch space. Twitch is a live streaming platform, usually for video games, but there are some people who do podcasts and like talk about science rather than games, or maybe throw in a little bit of gaming and do a lot of science, that kind of thing. Yeah, so there's some in the neuroscience space. So yeah, the one Twitch streamer I've watched a little bit of is Neuro Fourier, Doctor Neuro Fourier.
No, I've talked to him.
Yeah, he's very entertaining, and I remember his streams doing a lot of work during the pandemic, where he had this medical expertise, especially around vaccines and the ongoing developments. And a lot of people would come in and ask him like questions, and he would be able to sort of answer them or dismiss them, or and things like that. He got a lot of weird questions, of course, but he had that interactive element where he could at least respond in real time, and I always found that very interesting, and I guess a modern way of doing science communication, far more modern than showing someone a paper, or,
right?
This kind of thing. Yeah, so that was one example that came to mind.
Yeah, that's really cool. I actually did a YouTube live stream with Dr. Neurofourier a year and a half ago. But yeah, we did a little bit of that model where people popped into the YouTube chat and asked questions. I have a much smaller audience, so it was not a whole lot of people asking questions, but
I feel like, yeah, it's almost better to have a smaller-ish audience, because if it's too big, then you kind of get too many voices, and it makes it hard to manage. But
if you have a really big Twitch audience, I've seen how some of those chats can go. You can't pull out anything from them.
Right.
It just goes by too fast. You'd need like someone whose entire job it was to curate questions.
Yeah.
Kind of on a similar branch, I follow a cognitive psychologist on YouTube who, she doesn't do quite that, but when she uploads her videos, she uploads them as premieres, and then she's in the YouTube chat talking with the people who are watching the premiere live, and either saying things about like the production of the video or answering questions that people have about the content that she's talking about in the video. That is Cass Eris, if people want to check her out. So it's a little bit more, like, less on the scale of direct interaction, because it's not literally while she's recording, but it's still really cool.
She's still engaging with her audience.
Yeah.
I'd like to contrast that with another project that I thought was good, but is more one-off. And this was something I was part of in a few years ago. In Australia, we have something called the National Science Week, which is a good time to advertise and have science in the public consciousness. And my lab mate at the time, shout out to Dr. Kim Ransley, she organized a night of illusions. So it was a lot of psychology, vision scientists, and all sorts of scientists, ranging from grad students to professors, in one spot to demo certain illusions. So for example, the two illusions that I worked on, one was prism adaptation goggles, where if you wear these goggles, they shift your field of vision 2 degrees, and then if you wear them for long enough, then your field of vision, and so I had them play ring toss, and they would inevitably do really bad at the ring toss because their field of vision was adapted. So
initially, but then you like get better, and then when you take them off, you are going the other direction.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and that's a really fun effect for people to experience. And while I was there, I was explaining what was happening. Like I was explaining, this is what adaptation is. This is how the visual system and inputs are being encoded, and this is why you get this happens. And so this was happening with a range of demos in one spot, but it was, I think, 2 nights or maybe even 1 night, because it's hard to get an event the event space, host everyone in one place. And we had a lot of families and kids come through and experience it, and people having a night of fun. And I thought that was a really effective way of getting people's interests peaked in science. But it was one-off, like it was a one-time kind of, or maybe I think the goal was to have it annually, like an event, right? But I still thought it was effective, right? Different kind of goal, but still interesting, right?
Right, yeah. And that kind of, I think there's a lot of space and need for intentionality in science communication. Like, what are you trying to accomplish, and what's the best way to accomplish that? I think a problem with a lot of the projects in the paper was that in order to get funded, they needed to say that they were going to have these grand impacts on people's overall outlook on a topic of science or society or what have you. But they weren't set up to do that, because that's a very lofty goal. It requires a lot of work in a lot of different modes of science communication, all kind of like working together. But as you just pointed out, there can be really, really effective methods of science communication that are short term, but that do a lot to pique people's curiosity, especially when they're targeted at like young people who will then have the opportunity to learn more about the topic in school or decide to study it in college.
Yeah, speaking of young people, I've got 2 thoughts on this. The first is related to the Night of Illusions. At least in the US, there is this the Museum of Illusions. It's like an actual museum.
Oh yeah.
That's franchised. That's in different states, and it's the same illusions. And of course, I had to go. I had to check it out, and it was cool, but kind of like that's it. Like it was like cool. Like people were like, "Oh, this is neat," and then nothing beyond that.
It didn't really do something to like educate people about why the illusion is happening, or like the psychology behind it, or
it was more entertaining. And like for example, there's they had this setup where you walk along a bridge, but they've got a canister that's around the bridge, and it's rotating with all these lights, so it gives you this massive motion signal that you're moving, and then so you suddenly struggle to walk in a straight line across this bridge, and things like that. It would be very cool to have someone like
explain
the effect, and so on and so forth. So in Chicago, there is a museum called MindWorks that has a bit more connection between the displays and the exhibits, and like a little science research element to it, where you could participate in studies, or they do research kind of there at the museum as well.
Cool.
And there's one here in Adelaide called MOD. I think MOD stands for Museum of Design, but I might be wrong. Which also has this kind of idea of you can have data collections. It's tied to the universities, and you can have data collection happen in the university. In the museum, as they look through the exhibits, and the goal is to entertain as well as collect data and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's definitely gradations and things like that. But it's mostly targeted at families and kids usually, because that's who goes to museums these days. There's tension in the education, like how we educate people at universities. A lot of online format, kind of having to, like the lecture's old school now. Like sitting
especially
in front of a lecture.
Post-COVID,
yeah. And it feels like a generational shift, right? Like younger generations don't like that anymore, and they feel like online content that they can access at any moment and sort of sit down and watch and learn from is better and more effective and just more enjoyable.
Right. There's a lot of different ways to interact with online content. We were talking about a few of them earlier, but No stodgy lectures for the kids these days. Not that that was
Yeah.
maybe that was never the best like pedagogical method.
Right, that was not the way. But it makes me think about how audiences shift. So, firstly, the need to be targeted with specific audiences, but also how one method might have worked for a specific generation, and then now we need to turn it on its head and get away from that sort of framework and fix it for the or not fix it, but like redo it, right? Always evolve.
Right. And like there wasn't TikTok in the 90s, so it's not like you could have done some of the ways that you can now do science communication and science education. Like the technology has changed. But
yeah, I feel like as a field or like scientists in general, we're kind of slow. Like we're slow to like get there and get on.
We're on the bleeding edge of research, and we're still using Windows 95.
Yeah, it feels like, and yeah, it feels like we're relying on. This may be a harsh term. I'm trying not to use this in a dichotomous sense, but like non-scientists to do the communication for us. For example, science writers to come to us and gather and synthesize. We're relying on genuinely interested individuals who's made it their job. Like I think about on YouTube, Hank and John Green, who run like Complexly and that kind of stuff. Who have this whole
they have a whole
series
media
of
ecosystem.
free videos. Yeah, and free videos that are teaching people, like educating people on these, like I think they're aimed at high school students, but anyone could watch them. Things like psychology topics. Like I've seen their work on attention and memory. I was like, that's pretty good. And then like neuroscience is done there too.
Nice.
So yeah, I feel like we're missing a trick here as a field, and we're also not really rewarding that kind of work or thinking.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge part, is that you don't get citations from a YouTube video. You don't get like protected time to do a podcast. Like it's definitely
it's not part of the workload model.
No, it's not incentivized. You have to do either you get hired specifically in a science communication role, or you have to do it entirely outside of your real job, quote unquote, which makes it difficult. And then I think something I was thinking about with making scientific content for these new-ish social media platforms is that it's a lot of work. I mean, writing a paper is obviously a lot of work, but then you get citations. But even TikTok is like, you put in a lot of work for less than a minute long content. And you have to do that regularly to build an audience so that people actually see the information that you're trying to put out there. Same thing for a podcast, same thing for a YouTube video. You need to do so much legwork and a lot of creative work that scientists aren't really trained to do. We're not incentivized to do. So I see why we're lagging behind, and it takes people who either want to do it as a very time-consuming hobby, or people whose job it is who didn't come from a science background initially, which, creates problems in translation and adds to the impression among the public that not only are scientists not always rigorous, but we're not, like, hip with the times. We're, like, old and stuck in the mud and not communicating, not interacting where people are, not meeting people where they're at, and expecting people to come to us and be like, oh, I'm interested in your science. Why? Because you read our paper? No, that's not gonna happen.
Right. What? And it bothers me that we default to this kind of thing. Like in my philosophy of science should have a positive impact on society by bringing about knowledge and having rigorous explicitly checked interventions that provide benefits, say in the medical field and whatever and whatnot. And so it blows my mind that we can truly operate within a bubble where we just do our science and it happens and it's published in papers, yet like no one sees it, no one's read it, or like it's only science. Like it feels something's off there for me.
Right. It's this big, it's this big game of like misplaced incentives and good intentions that are just totally subsumed into playing the game of doing science, which, yeah, you point out, it's super insular. It's super wrapped up in what are other people in my field doing? How am I going to publish in this high impact journal that nobody has access to anyway? And even if they did, they wouldn't know what the heck they were reading. Like, yeah, the incentives are super messed up. The output is really messed up, I think. I wonder, here's the thing I just thought of. So a lot of, especially these like super high impact journals, require a lot of work and experiments, and honestly some of the papers seem like it sprawls out beyond what the initial like research questions set out to do, because you have to. And I'm wondering if we could somehow restructure the incentives to where maybe you do a little less but do less, scientists. No, you do a little less on the experiment front. You keep papers tighter, more coherent around a specific question. And then maybe even, especially if you want to publish it somewhere that's super high impact, you have to have an output that is for the public, not just the like lay summary that some of these journals include now because they're trying to pay lip service. Like, you actually have to have an output that explains at least a part of this research that you are publishing that is somewhere where people are really actually going to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love that. I think about like for every paper that I get published, having like a adjoining YouTube video that kind of is like an explainer in like lay words or in plain English, to try and make it more accessible, especially because I find it really hard when writing papers to imagine what my audience is and write it in a way that like gets the message across. Like there's some basic stuff like try and be brief and clear and strip away all the fluff and whatever. But it's hard to know what someone will get out of the paper and what, like, even why they turn to that paper in the first place, right? So I thought like YouTube videos explaining could maybe be a better catch-all, as well as, you know, give an interface for, you know, comments or people to reach out. And I'm always, even on this podcast, I'm like, yeah, email me, whatever. I don't care about if I get 200 emails, that's fine.
Yeah, I wish, actually. Email me more, please.
yeah, start conversations with me, please. Yeah, there's this interesting divide, and like we do really have to divorce ourselves from prestige metrics, from journal impact factors, from citations. And
right, because that doesn't mean that anybody who's not our little bubble of people really knows what we did. And especially, I mean, in any field of research, but especially like me coming from biomedical research, like, isn't the idea we're studying things that like affect people? Don't you think that people want to know about it?
Yeah, right. Yeah, sometimes I think about that a lot. I'm like, why are you doing the thing that you're doing? You probably have a motivation. Like, be open about it. Why not? Like, let people know and see what people come by and like want to find out about your research. I will say though, this is not my preferred model, but there does come a point when you get enough expertise and credentials where media does come to you, where you do get these like sort of chances at public engagement. But again, it is sort of one-off, not really designed with the science in mind, I guess. Like I think
it's
a lot
about the person, right?
yeah, it's like, oh, you are an expert in this thing. Listen to, like, we'll put you in a public lecture situation, and then you can talk about it, and we'll get whichever audience. And
Yeah.
if you're not studying a topic that is that important, or like currently in the, like,
In vogue, hot button
yeah, right,
topic.
then those opportunities might also not come up.
Right.
Um,
It also like kind of creates this idea that we do foster a little bit in science, but especially when we're presenting ourselves outside of our own little bubble, that like there's this one genius brilliant person who came up with all of this stuff, and I've put them in front of you to talk to you about all the genius brilliant stuff that they've done and come up with. And even if they take pains in their talk, which they don't, to emphasize that like it's always a group effort, and papers have like 10, 15 authors on them, like even if they emphasize that, the impression that people are left with is this one genius brilliant scientist who's done a lot of genius brilliant stuff, which both makes science seem less accessible because, at least some people might think, oh, they're a genius brilliant scientist and I could never, understand the things that a genius brilliant scientist understands. And also creates this like distance where it's not a human endeavor that you're doing science anymore. It's like this one great man or woman or non-binary person doing science.
Speaking of people who might claim to be a great, brilliant scientist for their own benefit, it might be fun to talk about some examples that we kind of see science communication going very wrong, or not well, very wrong in our eyes.
Yes.
I think it would be no surprise to our listeners, I think, or at least I think it's very clear who we're thinking about. So in the neuroscience field, we have now a very popular podcast run by Huberman.
Yeah.
And for those who are unfamiliar, which would be surprising, you've done well to avoid this.
Maybe for those who are unfamiliar, stop now. Save yourself.
Yeah. Just skip ahead to the end of the episode. Andrew Huberman is I want to get the institution right. Stanford?
Yes.
Stanford neuroscientist, professor who had run his own lab, and he's become famous as of late because of his podcast, the Huberman podcast or Huberman Lab podcast.
Yeah.
And in this podcast, it's a lot of, he uses a lot of let's say biological neuroscience-y, what I would call seductive and alluring explanations to talk about effects. And he has this sort of I want to say it's like test creel's the term that comes to mind, but it's like this sort of like, we can hack and optimize your life by doing all these little things. And it's all evidence backed
Right.
by like this neuroscience and the biology and the research.
Right. This supplement will improve your productivity because of dopamine neurons, I guess.
Right. Very simple like explanations like caffeine works this way, and so therefore you should consume caffeine in this manner because that's how that works. That's this kind of like one-off simplistic mechanisms for the effects that he's trying to profess. And he does his podcast kind of in the style of Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Like you can kind of this like, I am the one expert and it's all around me and my opinions. He does have, he does bring on guests, expert guests. So he does have that back and forth, but it's generally his episodes are just himself and him talking about
And about
some topic.
his opinions. He's a
Yes.
He's a optic nerve researcher, which makes me wonder why he knows so very much about lots of things that are not the optic nerve or the eyeball.
Yeah, I think this really contrasts well with intellectual humility, and to sort of tie it more so to scientific communication. I find it really hard to communicate the nuances or the things that we're debating, like in science, like the things that we're trying to check within the details, within the margins, maybe. And it's hard to communicate that nuance like very effectively and cleanly. And also to give the message, we generally know something is this way. We're arguing about these little things or these little mechanisms, but that's where the debate is.
Right.
To try and give an example, another example of, I think there's a common narrative that screen time is destroying adolescents' attention span and ruining their critical thinking and their education and so on and so forth.
Right.
And that's a very common narrative. But
which kind of on face value seems, true, or at least it's easy to believe.
And there are definitely people who are trying to promote that message. One of them being John Haidt. And so, the research there is mixed. And, we kind of have seen effects where there's no effect. We kind of have seen studies where there is a big effect. We've seen studies where it's true for some people, not for others. Like, there's nuances there that are hard to communicate. But if we talk in a sort of media narrative situation, the media wants like a clean, entertaining story, and they'll say, yeah, screen times are ruining adolescents' social media attitudes. Fear, harm. Right.
It hits a lot of the, and I think this is true also for what the Huberman podcast does, is it hits a lot of hot button issues around fitness, health, attention, nutrition, all of these things that like are in the domain of improving your life or living a better life, that are difficult to do precisely because it's so complicated. What works for one person isn't going to work for another person. One person might be able to get fit and lose weight by like going to the gym and just like being a little bit more careful about what they eat. For a lot of other people, that's not going to work. There's a lot of other factors at play, sort of similar for kids and attention. Some kids have a predisposition to have problems with attention, and others don't. And there's a lot of gradation in between there. So yeah, the central problem of like, people want, not just the media wants, but I think life is so uncertain. You want advice from people who seem like they know what they're talking about what you should do. Because it's really, really hard to figure out, how much should you exercise? What should you eat? How much should your child be on their cell phone? These are difficult questions that it makes it really appealing when someone comes in and is like, I know the answer.
Yes. This is going to be a bit of an aside, so I do want to come back to this. But what you're talking about reminds me specifically of a philosopher called C Thi Nguyen. He has a great paper on the seduction of clarity, where if things are clear, like if things seem clear, that collapses your critical sort of juices. You're sort of like, oh, it's clear, so therefore I understand, and then you stop interrogating or investigating that thought. C Thi Nguyen, his other work, which is very interesting, is on video games. And he's written a book called Agency as Art, I think is the title. And it touches on, his point is that video games give you that agency, and in a sense give you that clarity, because you know what structure, you know the action you need to take. So essentially you can escape from the uncertainty of the real world here by playing a video game and being sure what you need to do and having a goal and having it very aligned and set out for you. So that's sort of what comes to mind for me when we think about, it's like there's this want of clarity. There is this want of simplicity that is very hard to capture in science, and it's also just sort of not indicative of the real world. There's a lot more chaos in the real world than we care for.
Right. And so the kind of podcast that the Huberman Lab represents, or other similar people in a similar sphere. You mentioned Joe Rogan, also Jordan Peterson traffics in this a lot. It's not only easier to communicate, it's easier. It would be way easier. We'd spend way less words saying, like, you know, pain is this way and therefore you should do this and your pain will go away, right? We spend way less words doing that than to actually talk about how complicated the underlying science is. So it's easier on the side of the science communicator. They can have something that's way more digestible and spend a lot less time thinking about it. And on the side of people who are consuming that, like, science communication media, it is easier to believe and understand because of the desire for clarity, right? That, like, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. He sounds so clear. He sounds so sure of himself. And he says that if I only buy the supplement that he is selling, then I will also be healthy and strong and live to be 155.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's, yeah. I mean, to try and give a balanced take.
Fair and balanced TM.
To try and give a fair yeah. Which truly won't be balanced because I think I'm so biased one side that it would be impossible to be neutral here. But anyway, it's cool that a lot of people want these scientific answers and evidence. Mm-hmm. So I think that's cool.
There's an appetite for it. Yeah.
There's an appetite for it. And he has been successful in bringing in people like who are interested and maybe were on the fringes into thinking about science and thinking about studies and research. And he's bringing this sort of format, like the science podcast format, and showing how useful it is and how successful it could be for one's life. Granted, it is slightly capitalistic in that it's selling a lot of he's selling a lot of supplements, and then I worry about Big Farm being involved somehow. But anyway, all my sort of worries aside, there is a I guess I'm trying to put a silver lining on this in that
right.
That kind of success is there, and it seems like we need people to sort of be involved and invest and try and replicate and reproduce a similar kind of thing in a way that sort of better communicates the science and the is sort of more rigorous, really. Yeah.
Right.
Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think the thing that it's really hard to try to replicate that kind of success. Because I was reading a little background on him, and during the pandemic, he just kind of started making YouTube videos of the stuff that his lab did. And of course, with success, it morphed into what it is. But he got really popular probably partially because of his ability to speak to people and ability to communicate science, partially because of the fact that it was the pandemic and everyone was trapped inside looking for something to, like, do and watch. Partially probably because of, I talked about this actually with someone earlier in the summer, like, his demographics, to, you know, not to put a damper on your or my parade, but he's like an attractive white man.
Yeah, he keeps himself well, you know, like, yeah, there's a lot of luck involved with success, I think. And there are a lot of, I think, well-meaning podcasts that don't get that kind of success, even though they do all the right things. Right. So there's, again, being comfortable with the chaos, luck. There's a lot involved. I suppose that's a good point to sort of shout out some of the good things we've seen, or some of the better science communicators that we have come across. The first one I want to shout out is Adam Omari with the Nature and Nurture podcast. Also, I believe they're an undergrad or graduate student. I'll just call them an early career researcher who brings on and interviews professors and it's fascinating how he does it, because he's got this sort of how do you describe it? This starry-eyed kind of like, I want to learn, like infectious, like I want to listen, and that vibe is really draws me into his podcast. So shout out to that one.
Yeah.
Do you have a few to list off?
Yeah. In addition to the ones I've already mentioned, so Community for Rigor, and obviously your podcast, Neuro4E4, is another one. And the Science Night folks, they have a science communication podcast that is called Science Night. And they approach it from a like kind of nerdy angle. So I got together with them at Gen Con, which is this big like gaming convention, and they did a panel called The Science of Science Fiction, and they talked about Fallout. Both from a like psychology and research ethics perspective, because I've never played Fallout, so I don't know, but apparently they put people in these bunkers that are psychological experiments on these people who are living through this nuclear wasteland, and it is very questionable ethically, but also it's a bunch of psychology experiments on people, like what would happen if you only ever lived in a place where everything you did was gambling. So that was cool. And then they talked about the actual like nuclear fallout part of Fallout with a nuclear physicist. So I really love their combination of pop culture in the form of science fiction with science, because there's real science in science fiction. Science fiction is a speculative endeavor that builds on what we have right now and thinks about like what could come of that in the future, both for better and for worse in the case of Fallout, it seems. So
Yeah.
check them out. They're super nerdy and super cool.
Oh, just to add a sidebar to that, as a vision scientist myself, I think we had our moment in the sun when it was the dress, the color constancy issue, and I was like, we should have like milked that. Like we should have been like all over everywhere. Like
right,
whatever. But now our moment's gone for now.
I can't make myself see the proper colors that the dress is like. What?
I don't even remember. I remember it's either blue or black or yellow and gold. And there is a study, I think, I can't remember the details exactly, but someone set out to try and like replicate the effect. And it was hard to remove the pre-existing notions of what color an object should be. For example, you can't use like a banana as a stimuli because people are like, yeah, that's yellow.
Right.
And they ended up using Crocs as the stimuli because it was like no one has any idea what colors Crocs should be. So they showed Crocs under all these different like illuminations and things like that, and like showed it's color constancy with like light priors and things like that, like expectations about where the lights are influence what colors you see. Anyway,
that's cool.
Yeah. I'm gonna shout out. I mean, this is a well-loved science communicator, but Ed Yong for The Atlantic is a great scientific writer who I think goes about it the right way, and he's just like a really good writer. So really wanted to shout out him. He's won a lot of awards. He's got some great books. So wanted to shout out that. Any other science communication efforts you want to shout out?
I'm trying to think. There's this really cool set of books. I forget who they're by, but one of them is called The Violinist's Thumb, and they're like whole books that are about the impact of science on like observable phenomena. Like the violinist's thumb is like how professional violinists' thumbs have to be able to play the instrument, and how that's affected by genetics and practice and the environment and all sorts of different things. So hang on. Okay. The full title of the book is by Sam Keen, and the full title is The Violinist's Thumb and Other Tales of Love, War, Genius as Written by Our Genetic Code.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, add that to your reading list. I guess one last thing to talk about is if you want to be part of science communication, or like want to get involved, what would your first steps be?
Ooh.
What would you try?
What would you try? I mean, honestly, if you have an idea, go for it. Anybody can start a podcast. Anybody can also start a blog. That's probably in some ways a little bit easier. If you have an idea and you want to get it out into the world, you can just go for it. You can also find people around you who are doing similar things. I was on one episode of a podcast that a neurology resident did here before I started my own podcast that kind of, I got to see the behind the scenes and understand how it actually works. So like find other people's projects and ask them how they do it. Check out books from your local library. I know that's not super helpful, but just start. Yeah.
Get involved. Yeah. And actually I think a part of this message is we do need to put more attention on how we communicate our science and to try alternatives and to evolve in that space as well.
Do your creative, wacky, crazy idea that you don't see anyone else doing, because that's going to be the one that's the most impactful.
Nice. One last thing to shout out is the In Plain English podcast, which I think is amazing. Definitely go check it out. Where can we find the episodes?
Yeah, you can find the episodes by searching In Plain English Science on any of your favorite podcast apps. You can also find the episodes and the papers at inplainenglishpod.org. And we are on Twitter and Instagram at Plain English Sci. That's SCI at the end for science. And I guess this is a good place to talk about this. If you are interested in doing science communication, reach out. I'm always looking for guests. I'm always looking for content experts. I'm also always looking for people who want to be the non-expert guest. If you're just super interested in science and want to come on and learn a lot about a really niche topic, please reach out via social media or the website.
Yeah, how can they reach out to you specifically?
To me specifically, my Gmail at inplainenglishpod@gmail.com.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, highly recommend. At least definitely give it a listen. I thought the episodes are great. I'll link our episode in the show notes, which is also more on research and reproducibility and rigor and things like that. And I'll provide a link in the show notes in the episode.
Amazing.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to wrap up. Any last things you want to mention?
I guess if you are in the US, make sure that you have a plan to vote.
Good shout out. And so same goes for the Reproducibility podcast. If you have topics or want to come on as a guest, feel free to reach out to us. You'll find out about us at reproducibility.org, T spelled like the drink. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you, Jamie, for coming on and being a guest.
Thank you. This was super fun.
All right. Bye, everyone.